Francis Crick, The Structure of DNA. He once wrote about his experience of meeting religious scientists, and he says, occasionally I meet them and I'm a bit embarrassed because I cannot believe anyone who accepts truth by revelation. So obviously that hurts my feelings a little bit, but I can also again understand where he's coming from. And answering this objection, this suspicion that there's something about my life which is a little bit schizophrenic, is, as I said, important to me. And it's something I've had to give a lot of thought to. Now, I take courage in this by the fact that people like James Watson certainly don't represent the overwhelming opinion among scientists. In fact, there are many, many great scientists right through history, right up to the present day, who are not only happen to be Christians, but are fundamentally motivated by their Christian faith. James Watson started the Great Human Genome Project, this big project to map the entirety of the human genome, a project that was completed by his successor, Francis Collins, in 2006. And he not only saw through the completion of this project, but did it 3 years ahead of schedule. And he wrote a book called The Language of God. And in the end of this book, he describes, after describing the story of the Human Genome Project and his career as a scientist, he goes on to explain how he became a Christian. And he said this, he said, I had started this journey of intellectual exploration to confirm my atheism. That now lay in ruins as I was forced to admit the plausibility of the God hypothesis. And if nothing else, I think that should give us pause that it's maybe not quite as simple as someone like James Watson would have us believe. It's quite possible to be someone deeply committed to the scientific method and yet find oneself intellectually compelled towards embracing the Christian faith. And really that's the idea that I'd like us to think a little bit more deeply about today. Now, I'll skip over that slide. The basic idea, the reason why science and faith are often seen in conflict, it really boils down to two reasons. First of all, there's this strong belief that science has done away with the need of Christianity, of religion. So Peter Atkins, another famous atheist scientist and a popularizer of science, he says this, he says, science, the system of belief founded securely on publicly shared reproducible knowledge, emerged from religion. And as science discarded its chrysalis to become its present butterfly, it took over the heath. The idea there is that though religion had a role to play in kind of humanity's intellectual history, that role has now been thoroughly superseded by science. And so like a butterfly emerging from a restrictive chrysalis, so science has allowed us to discard the restrictions of religion and really spread our wings like the enlightened butterflies that we are. He goes on to say, there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious hope for some dark corner of the physical universe or of the universe of experience that science can never hope to illuminate. So there's two very important claims here for why people often think that science and religion are in conflict. First of all, there is the sufficiency of science, this idea that science can answer all of the most fundamental, the most important questions we have, and really that leaves no room for belief in God or religious belief. The second important belief is this idea that science is unique in its ability to give us reliable knowledge of this world, of the world, this publicly accessible, reproducible knowledge. Compared to science, religion offers no security, no publicly shared reproducible knowledge. And so these are the two ideas I'd like us to think about today. First of all, the sufficiency of science, the ability of science to explain all of our most urgent, deepest, most important questions that we have as human beings. And secondly, the exclusivity of science, the idea that only science really gives us reliable knowledge of the world. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about my research, really just to show and reiterate the sheer power of science. There's no denying that science is one of the most powerful ways we have of understanding the world. One of the big breakthroughs in my field was the discovery of something called induced pluripotent stem cells by this chap here called Shinya Yamanaka, a Nobel Prize winning researcher from Japan. Shinya Yamanaka discovered these things called induced pluripotent stem cells. What does that mean? So the word pluripotent there describes the ability of stem cells. This is the thing that makes stem cells so unique and exciting. Their ability to specialize and become all of the different cells that make up our body. That's their pluripotency. So right at the beginning of our lives, when we were a little ball of cells, we were made up of stem cells, and these stem cells would eventually divide and specialize into all of the different cells, the bone cells and brain cells and skin cells that make up our body. Now, as we develop, our cells very quickly lose this potential, which means that when we get injured, our body doesn't repair itself. Shinya Yamanaka made this really amazing discovery that it's possible to tinker genetically with some of our cells, some skin cells from our inside of our cheek or something like that, and kind of reprogram them to become stem cells again, to recover the potential our cells had right at the beginning of our development. Amazing thing. It means that one day scientists may be able to take some of your skin cells, grow them up in the lab, turn them into stem cells, and then use them to make new neurons to treat your Parkinson's or new pancreatic cells to treat your diabetes. It's a very powerful technology. How did he demonstrate what he'd done? Well, what he did was an important experiment where he took some of his stem cells that he'd made from the skin of a mouse, and he injected them back into another mouse embryo. That's what you see here. This is a mouse embryo. These are the stem cells labeled green that are being injected into this mouse embryo. Now, if they were old skin cells, those cells would die and not do anything, and probably that embryo would die. But his idea was that if they were stem cells, they'd go on to fuse with that embryo and contribute to all of the tissues and cells that made up the mouse that develops from the embryo. And that's what he found happened. He made this chimeric mouse. So half of this mouse is made up from the original mouse embryo, and half of the cells in this mouse are made up from those cells that were growing only months earlier in Shinya Yamanaka's lab. Very powerful. And just to prove it, he labeled some of those cells green, and he made multicolored fluorescent mice from these different types of cells. It was a very, very powerful demonstration of an astonishing discovery. And it's exactly this kind of thing that gives science such power, such credibility in our world. Another great popularizer of science, Richard Dawkins, describes this credibility when he says, "Science boosts its claim to truth by its spectacular ability to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command and to predict what will happen and when." And many people have seen the power of science and its unique ability to give us this reliable knowledge of our world, and said, well, you know what? Science is really the only way we have of knowing anything reliably at all. And so what we need to do is we need to limit ourselves to explaining the world only through what science can tell us. Because of the exclusivity of science, we need to show its sufficiency, its ability to explain everything about ourselves, the world, the universe, and everything. And this is now a very, very developed project, and a very an idea that's often argued for. One of the big philosophers behind this idea is a man called Daniel Dennett. He once wrote a book a while ago now that he humbly entitled Consciousness Explained. And in it, he describes his method. He's trying to explain human consciousness. And he says, there is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. We can, in principle, we're not there yet, but scientists are working on it, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials. Science is the only really reliable way we have of knowing anything. Therefore, we have to explain everything about ourselves, the universe, and everything only in terms of what we can do through the scientific methods, the stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. Now, that might sound like quite a sensible idea, but it can lead to some very counterintuitive, some very unsatisfying results. One of the people who tried to show the surprising conclusions that arise from this was James Watson's colleague, Francis Crick. He tries to show how this, he says, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Another writer, Richard Dawkins again, was once asked by a Christian interviewer to explain love. What does love mean? He was asked, when you think about your wife, what does love mean? He says, Richard Dawkins, well, I've been into that before. It's an emotion, which is a manifestation of brain stuff. This was a Christian interviewer talking to him, and he asked, Jesus said love is the purpose of life. Does that sound nonsense to you? Dawkins said, it sounds like something grafted on, a superfluous excrescence on life, which I feel I understand better. But it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So for Richard Dawkins, love is nothing more than emotion, a manifestation of brain stuff. And any idea that we have that love is of much deeper significance to that, to what our lives are about, to what makes our lives meaningful, is something we're imposing on reality. It's a story we're telling ourselves to make ourselves feel better about things, but it's not really true. Because love is nothing more than an emotion. It's a spurious purpose we're putting onto the universe, because love is nothing more than an emotion, a manifestation of brain stuff. Now, clearly, love is an emotion. Clearly, it does arise out of our brains, but surely we'd want to say something more about it than that. But Richard Dawkins is very committed to this idea that science has to explain everything. And therefore, the only explanation open to him for love is this rather limited type of explanation he gives us. Now, intuitively, I think that seems inadequate. It seems to us like love is more important than Richard Dawkins is making out. And there must be something more to say about love than simply that it's an emotion, a manifestation of brain stuff. But there's also a harder philosophical problem with what Richard Dawkins is saying. We can say it doesn't feel right, but there's also a problem, a real problem with what he's saying. And that comes out in the last thing he says when he starts talking about our brains. It doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. He's talking about our brains, what they are, what they're for. So let's think a bit more about our brains then in this view of the world. Another philosopher, again committed to this idea that everything should be explained only in terms of biology, is a philosopher called Patricia Churchland from the University of California. And she talks about what our brains are for. She says this: boiled down to essentials, the principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. A fancier style of representing, by which she means our ability to think and try and make sense of the world, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chance of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So for Patricia Churchland, the reason we have brains, the reason we think, the reason we try and make sense of the world, the reason we could add we do science in the first place, cannot be to discover what's true and what's not. because that's not what our brains are for. The only reason we have brains is to help our bodies survive long enough to pass on our genes. Any sense that we have that our brains tell us what is true or false is again something that goes beyond what the purpose of our brains is. We can't trust our brains to tell us what's true or false any more than we can trust our heartbeat to keep track of time. That's simply not what our brains are for. Now, there's a problem with this, isn't there? Because if we can't trust our brains, then we can't trust our brains even when our brains tell us we can't trust our brains. It's an idea that philosophers would call self-refuting, an idea that undermines itself, and an idea that undermines science itself. Another philosopher who recognizes this, he puts it very powerfully. He says, this biologistic image of humans, this attempt to squeeze ourselves only into what biology can tell us, effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorize about evolution or to develop neuroscience. He then says, if Darwin's On the Origin of the Species really were the last word on humanity, the only thing to say about us, then it could not have been written. This is a very powerful point. This idea that if you kind of censor out anything in our human story that's not validated by a science experiment, if you squeeze yourself only into what biology, chemistry, and physics can tell us, if that's the only explanation of ourselves that we're able to give, then our story doesn't make sense anymore. It becomes incoherent. So it seems then, I think, in order to make sense of ourselves, make sense of love, make sense of even science itself, we have to go beyond what science alone can tell us. But that's a problem, isn't it? That's the whole point we started with. What is there beyond science that could possibly give us such reliable knowledge of the world? Bertrand Russell once made this point very strongly. He said, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. What science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. What is there beyond science? What can we know beyond science? Now, again, there's a very obvious or significant problem with what Bertrand Russell is saying here. Bertrand Russell is clearly claiming to know something by saying what he says here, and yet Bertrand Russell is not a scientist. He did not discover what he's claiming to know through scientific methods. He discovered it by sitting in his chair, smoking his pipe. He's saying, in other words, that we don't really need to listen to what he's saying. And so we're not going to. But what I do want us to see is the mistake that he's made. And this, I think, is a very, very important mistake. It's this idea that everything can be explained only through science alone. One philosopher said that it's a very powerful temptation to think that you have this great method and then everything in the world needs to be explained by this method alone. If you have a method, the temptation is always to try and make everything fit into what you can find out through your method. Now, that sounds a bit philosophical, but it's a very basic mistake to make. This was my daughter Anya when she was only about 9 or 10 months old. And at this stage, I think she'd already begun to learn that this was a mistake, this mistake I'm talking about. When she was about this age, I might be playing with my phone in front of her like a good father, and obviously she'd want to play with my phone. When she was about 9 months, it would be enough for me to simply take my phone and put it away in my pocket, and she'd forget about my phone, forget it existed, and go on to wanting something else she couldn't have. But a few months later, that no longer worked. She discovered something very important about the world. Just because she couldn't see something didn't mean it wasn't available for her to play with. She just needed to use a different method to get access to my phone. She needed to tug on my sleeve or put on a cute face like that. And moments later, she'd be able to get access to my phone and play with it. And scientists actually know this, and they learn this very early on. It's no good saying, I've got this really great method. It always gives me reliable results. So I'm going to squeeze my subject into only what I can find out using this method. An astronomer doesn't look through her telescope and say, well, you know, my telescope can only see so far. So I'm going to squeeze my understanding of the universe only to what I can find out through looking through my telescope. Now, scientists know that they've got to find new ways of seeing further. Scientists are always asking a very important question. The question, what if? What if there is more out there? What if it worked like this? How would we gain access to it? So as we come to the close, what I want to do is to revisit this question of purpose and ask, what if? What if there was a purpose to our lives here? What if the purpose of our lives had something to do with love? What if the purpose of our brains was shock horror, actually to try and discover what was true about the world around us? What if there was a purpose to being here? How would we go about discovering what that purpose is? A very helpful idea that I found in thinking about this is a statement by a philosopher, theologian called Leslie Newbigin. And he talks about the difference between cause and purpose. He says cause can be discovered by science, these sequences of cause and effect, which you can do experiments to investigate. But purpose cannot, because until the purpose has been realized, it is hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. Until the purpose has been realized, it's hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. Newbigin recognized that a purpose was something that persons have. People who can look forward and make desires and form plans and decide how to achieve those plans. That's what a purpose is. And he says, until that purpose is realized, it's hidden. It's hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. He gives an illustration of coming across a building site. You're walking along and you see maybe some bricks stacked up here and there and some tools lying on the ground. And you decide there is some kind of purpose to what's going on here. I think is a good illustration because it's kind of how we encounter life. There's lots of mess and chaos and unfinished business, but there's also all kinds of signs that our lives are significant, that this life means something, that there is a purpose to being here, the sense of morality, the sense of beauty. But how do we discover what that purpose is? Well, Newbigin said you've got two options. You can go back every day to the building site and wait until the building is finished and discover at the end of the process what that purpose was. You can wait, in other words, until the purpose is realized. Or, he says, you can go and talk to the architect, the builder, the one whose purpose it is, and ask them to reveal it to you. And Newbigin says, when it comes to discovering the purpose of the universe or even the purpose of our lives, waiting around until the end is just not an option. If we're to discover the purpose for why we're here, the one whose purpose it is needs to make it known. At the heart of Christianity is the claim that God himself, the one whose purpose it is, has made not just his purpose, but his very self known and knowable to us. One of the early accounts of Jesus' life was written by his friend John, and he started with some very famous words. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, That word is the Greek term logos, where we get our word logic from. It's the old Greek idea that behind everything there was a purpose, a reason, a kind of integrating principle or idea that could make sense of everything. And John takes this word and he does something very interesting with it. He personalizes it. He says, he was in the beginning with God. This word is not something, it's someone. But then he goes even further and he says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. This word, this one behind everything, this one whose purpose it is, has made himself known to us, has made himself accessible to us by becoming one of us and living among us. Ultimately, the reason I think science is so successful, so powerful, is not really because of the ingenuity of its methods, though it's often very ingenious, nor because of the commitment of scientists or the rigors of the scientific community, although all of that is very important. Ultimately, the reason science is successful is because of the accessibility of its subject matter. Science deals with the stuff you can get hold of, the stuff you can prod and poke and manipulate and control. And when science advances and goes forward, it's normally because a new method has come along, or a new way of seeing, or a new technology that means a whole new area of reality has become accessible to us in a way that it wasn't before. Science is successful because of the accessibility of its subject matter. John says the reason we can know God, the reason we can know the one whose purpose it is for exactly the same reason, because this God has made himself accessible to us. What does that mean? Two things as we finish. It means, first of all, that God has made himself accessible to our scrutiny. You can't scrutinize a private revelation in a cave, or a mystical experience, or a lofty philosophy. But this claim, the claim that God has become one of us, is a God we can explore. Because this God entered into history, he impacted history, he changed history. And so, like a cosmologist measuring cosmic radiation to discover the Big Bang, or a paleontologist looking at the impact of an asteroid to find out what happened to the dinosaurs. So we can look at the impact of this life on our world. We can see how he changed the first believers, what they said about him, how he changed the world, and discover and explore and scrutinize these claims for ourselves. But more than this God has made himself accessible not just to our scrutiny, but to people like you and me. This God has made himself accessible personally. Because ultimate reality is not something that we can prod and poke and manipulate and control. It's not some lofty philosophy that only great experts can discover. This is a God who has gone to great lengths to make himself knowable, even to people like you and me. This is a God who allows us and invites us to know him personally. Now, I'm a scientist. We scientists are not often people. And so that might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. But do you see, to rule out this possibility by saying, I'll only believe in stuff I can do experiments on, I'll only believe in stuff you can prove to me by science, is ultimately to decide the answer even before you begin exploring it. It's to try and tell the universe how it should be. It's not ultimately very scientific. If God is not something but someone, then the way we'll get to know him will change. When I met my wife, she said to me, hello, my name's Nay. If at that moment I'd have said to her, look, I'm sorry, I'm a scientist. I can't accept truth by revelation. You're going to need to give me some proof of your identity, please. I know for a fact, knowing her now as I do, that she would not be my wife today. I'd have never have got to know her. My method would have determined my reality. If we're to know this God who has gone to such great lengths to know us, we need to listen to what he says. We need to open ourselves up to the possibility that he actually wants us to know him. This is the invitation of the gospel, the invitation of what John puts before us in his words. How do we do that? Well, we look at what he claims, we investigate it, we scrutinize it for ourselves. But also, we start addressing ourselves to God. We start talking to him. We try and open ourselves up to him. Because if ultimate reality is not something, but someone, then this is a God who will make himself known to us. I'm going to finish there. Ultimately, I hope that you can see that by shutting down your investigations and only believing in stuff that science can tell you, ends up deciding the answer even before you've begun the investigation. It also means that you're not able to discover the richness of the real world in which there is such a thing as purpose and personhood. Ultimately, it prevents us from seeing this God who has gone to such great lengths to make himself known to us. Thank you so much for listening. There's a lot more to say, and I hope that I prompted some questions. I'm really looking forward to finding out what your questions are. But now I'm going to hand over to Tim to take control of that. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thanks, John. Okay, folks, so this is your chance to ask questions. Not often you get to ask a doctor of science a question about science and about God. So a couple of minutes now, pop a question in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, then put it in the chat function next to the video and that will come back to me. And if you'd rather just email it to me, then the email address is info@gracechurchsydenham.org, and that address is actually in the first thing in the chat at the moment. So a couple of minutes, write down some questions, and then we'll have a chance to put them to John. Okay, are you ready, John?
Yeah.
Have a drink of water. See what we've got here. What are the, so here's a personal one. This is interesting, isn't it? It certainly occurred to me. What are the challenges you personally experience being a Christian scientist? I think I'll probably turn that around, being a scientist who's a Christian and a Christian scientist.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's been some personal challenges that I've had to think about quite a lot as a Christian working in the field of stem cell research. As you're probably aware, there's some controversy in the area of stem cell research with regards to the source of stem cells, and one of the most potent and common sources in this field is that of a very early human embryo. And so for a long time, the focus of stem cell research was on the potential of using stem cells derived from spare embryos from IVF treatment, also sometimes from fetal tissue. And as a Christian, for me, the question of what gives a life dignity and status and is a very urgent, important question, because ultimately, I believe that every single human life has great dignity and status. But then that raises the question of when does this human life begin? And this is a question I think that I've had to think about as a Christian, but actually I think everyone, and I've got colleagues as well, who've had to think a lot about this question. And for me, I reached the conclusion that even these very early stages of life has its dignity that comes from being made in the image of God. And so I, at various points in my career, had to make the decision not to work with these with stem cells derived from the very, very early embryo. That wasn't an easy decision, and it's still not something I feel 100% certain about, but it was something that I had to think about quite a lot. But then there's other challenges as well that I think are just moral challenges faced by all scientists. There's a lot of pressure as a scientist to succeed, to win grants, to write papers, and that pressure can be very, can cause you to want to take shortcuts, and that's something that lots of scientists will be very familiar with. And it can also cause you great emotional turmoil. And so it can cause pressure in your own personal life. And so just the pressures of work is something where I've had to learn to lean into God and to find my identity and my security in him and not in my success as a scientist. And that, I think, is something I've failed in at various points, and it's something I'm still struggling and working through. But this is really where the rubber hits the road for me as a scientist, trying to live out my faith in this quite high pressured environment. There's more I could say, but we should move on to another question.
Yeah, thanks, John. So a number of the questions seem to surround the interest in somebody like yourself who's in that environment with lots of clever people. What kind of arguments have you come up against from your colleagues, and what are the kind of things that maybe help them help them refute your argument, which, this evening, of course, seems to come across so clear and logical?
This argument is basically arisen out of my conversation with colleagues. And really the driving issue, I think, for my friends in science is this question of that scientists rely on evidence, and evidence takes a very particular form. This evidence comes from predictability, from being able to test hypotheses, do experiments to address these type of questions. And really that's the big thing for lots of my colleagues, especially perhaps my colleagues who are working in biomedical sciences, which is very what we call hypothesis-driven research. You come up with an idea and then you test it experimentally to see whether it holds true or not. And so for my colleagues, that's the big sticking point, really. And that's really why I've had to give this particular argument quite a lot of thought. And I think for me, showing that ultimately that it's a mistake to say I've got a great method and therefore I'll only use this method to explore the world is, even as scientists, we recognize very quickly that it is a mistake. And so it's helping my friends see that that's what they're doing when they're setting up this particular approach to understanding the world and saying, I'll only believe stuff that you can just prove to me using this particular approach. We don't do that in science. We shouldn't do that with regards to these big questions about God, because reality is richer than that. We ultimately have to try and respond to the way things are. We don't get to set the agenda for how things are known. So yeah, And that, I mean, and talking about personal relationships is really important. So, yeah, one of the things of being a scientist and also married is I've had to realize that doing experiments on someone is not a good way of getting to know them. To get to know a person, we need to take a different approach. And the same goes for getting to know God.
And have you ever been thrown any really difficult curveballs? As in, are there any particular arguments that are either really hard to deal with, or perhaps are still hard to deal with in terms of convincing colleagues or moving colleagues forward?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think these questions regarding science are not the hardest questions confronting the Christian faith. I think probably the harder questions relate to suffering and evil in the world and moral failures of Christians, my own letting people down at work. They're the things that I think people that have an impact and are the real significant arguments against Christian faith. And that's, I mean, I feel that personally as well. I think these questions regarding science, they do have answers, and these are questions I think we can be confident of in as Christians, these areas. I didn't really go into it, but science owes so much to the Christian faith. It's not an accident that science was born in essentially the Christian West. And when you look back through the history of science, again and again and again, you see many scientists who didn't just happen to be Christians. They were fundamentally motivated by their Christian faith. Christianity teaches us that ultimately this world makes sense and that it can make sense to me. Those assumptions are fundamental to even the possibility of doing science. And it's those assumptions that are being questioned by this very reductionistic way of understanding the world. And so I think there's a lot we can say and offer as Christians in this particular area.
Yeah. Good question here. What is your scientific perspective on the miracles in the Gospels? I suppose one of a quick response from many people that we meet and talk to nowadays is you can't believe the Bible because of the miracles that it talks about.
Yeah, I mean, that is a sticking point for some of my colleagues. I think there's the idea that a scientific law is, in some sense, and it's a description rather than it being a description of reality. It prescribes what reality can actually do and what can actually happen. But that's a mistake. When we do science, when we write laws, we are describing the way things normally work. That's what science is. When we come up with mathematical theorems or ideas that summarize nature, all we're doing is describing the way things normally work. It's the reproducibility that allows us to make these laws in the first place. And miracles, by very definition, are very different. Miracles are exceptional circumstances. They're things that are unique. They're things that is very hard to explore through the scientific method. And so I think that's probably the main distinction that I want to make. People sometimes use the term natural and supernatural, but that's a philosophical idea that we're putting onto science. Really, what we're describing in science is the way things usually happen, and we're coming up with laws to describe it. And theologians would say the reason that the reality is so stable and we can discover things and make predictions is because ultimately of God's faithfulness to this world. Augustine used to say, nature is what God does. Nature is what God does. He's the one who makes this world intelligible and consistent and reliable, such as we can explore it using mathematical laws. But that doesn't mean that occasionally, under certain circumstances and at key moments in history, God can't do something new. God's not constrained by those same laws.
Great. Now, you'll have to explain the question and the answer you give to this one. With regards to the Dennett quote, how do you answer someone who asks where all the physical comes from? I can't remember the Dennett quote. Can you?
So, Daniel Dennett was there talking about his methodological assumptions in studying consciousness. And he said something like, physics, biology, and chemistry is all there is, and everything therefore should in principle be explainable according to biology, chemistry, and physics. So that he was setting the agenda for how he was going to address the question of consciousness. What was the question? Sorry, Tim, I missed the end of it.
Yeah. How do you, so with regards to the Dennett quote, how do you answer someone who asks where does all the physical or where does all the matter, I guess, come from? Is that you, Ben? Josh,
could you explain the question a little bit more?
Unmute.
I can't hear you, actually. Sorry. I'll
unmute, mate.
I know he is unmuted, but we can't hear him.
Is it Ben's microphone again?
Oh, not to worry. I think. I think as a Christian, the answer is, I think it's a valid question, and where does the physical come from is one of the fundamental questions that cosmologists try to address, and I suppose you can answer it at different levels, but ultimately, as a Christian, we do have stuff to say about what the physical is and why it matters. The Bible makes it very clear that the physical is good, that it's part of God's good creation. People sometimes assume that Christians are a bit like the ancient Gnostics and it's all about the spirit and the soul, but actually for the Christian, the physical stuff that science explores and investigates and is obsessed with, the Bible affirms that and says, yeah, that's totally appropriate because the physical comes out of the very will of God. God spoke and there was light, there was land and sea, there was solid matter that came out of the universe. And so the Bible Christianity gives the physical great dignity and meaning. And so its exploration is absolutely something that we should celebrate and invest in. And the physical has a future as well. When Jesus Christ rose from the dead, he rose physically. Our future hope is of a physical new creation. And so, yeah, the physical is an important part of Christian theology that sometimes we don't always take as seriously as we should. I'm not sure if that got at what your question was. I'm sorry if it didn't.
What about the multiverse argument? I suppose that may have been thrown at some of us nowadays in terms of explaining. How do you deal with that question? Because it almost feels like maybe a question you can't deal with.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So I'm not a cosmologist, so this is way above my pay grade, and I can't say I have a strong opinion on it for that reason. People, the idea of the multiverse is ultimately, it seems, a way of explaining why the universe, is so fruitful and why life has emerged in the universes. People have often pointed out that the requirements for such a fruitful universe in which there's life requires such fine-tuning of the fundamental laws and constants of nature that to explain it simply by some chance outcome of a single Big Bang seems to be way beyond what would make sense. And so one solution to that is to propose multiple universes, and Big Bangs happening all over the place, and we just happen to be in the universe that was that was fruitful for life. You can probably tell by the way I've explained it that I have a basic suspicion, which is that it's simply a way of explaining away a problem that's not very satisfying. But I'm also very aware that there is more to the argument than that. And I think there is even some evidence that people point to for the idea that there could be multiple universes. From a theological perspective, I don't think it's necessarily threatening. The Bible's very clear. God is beyond what we can imagine. When the psalmist says, when I consider the heavens, the stars, what is man that you are mindful of him? He has that intuition that he is so small that God is way beyond what we can understand. And so the idea of multiple universes, I mean, it's just one further step once we consider the vastness of a single universe. So these kind of big scale questions, I think we can be open to as Christians, because the richer the universe, the more amazing, incredible, it all ultimately shines a light back on God's greatness and how beyond us he really is.
We've got time for one more, and I think this is a good one to end on. So in terms of arguing for the existence of a creator, that seems to be a large part of what you've been talking about tonight. But okay, so there's a God, but why the God of the Bible? Why are you personally convinced? Given that there are, I guess, God could be impersonal, a force, or conform to many other religions in the world. Why are you convinced that the God that you believe created the universe is the God of the Bible?
Thank you. Ultimately, it's through my encounter with the person of Jesus. I think there's a lot of, this is a question that I think you've got to take seriously. And I think looking at Christianity, looking at other religions is certainly something that you've got to explore and you've got to look at. But what I'd say is you've got to, when you look at Jesus, first of all, you've got to deal with simply what he claimed about himself. The fact that he claimed to be not just a prophet, not just a wise teacher, but he claimed to be God himself, God come to earth. And the magnitude of that claim, combined with the huge impact he's had on history, there's no more influential person than Jesus, means you've got to take that seriously. There's lots of crazy people who claim to be God, and there's lots of people who've had impact on the world, but there's only one person who's had such an impact and has made such big claims. And so that means, I think, that kind of provides a prima facie case for why you've got to take Jesus seriously. You've got to look into him. And for me, as you look into him, you realize that God is nothing like you imagine God to be, because when you realize that, it sounds arrogant to say that Jesus is God, but then what if it's true? What if it's true? What kind of God is this? If Jesus does represent him, this person who lived such a gentle, quiet life, but then was crucified on a cross. What kind of God allows himself to go through that and then says he did it for us to rescue us for himself? And when you kind of explore that and seriously consider it, it changes you and you start to trust him and you follow Jesus. And then, there's questions it answers, but then there's a whole new world of questions that it opens up as well. And that's really been my experience, that it makes things make sense, but it also makes the world much more interesting and better and good. It means that although there's so much evil in the world, there is one who is good and kind and true behind it all. And so really, I became a Christian because I discovered that Jesus was worthy of my trust, and I could trust him like I couldn't trust myself, I couldn't trust anyone else, but I could trust him. And so that's why I follow him now.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks, John. Thanks very much. So I'm sure there are other questions, and maybe tonight you'll be dropping off to sleep and another question will pop into your mind. That's fine. do pop it on an email to info@gracechurchsydenham.org, and we'll get that passed on to John, and I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm really happy that I've seen some more in the chat that we've not got to. So I'm really happy. If you want to send them on and you like a response, just I'd respond by email.
He's locked down for 2 weeks now. So
yeah, that's right.
But I also want to encourage those of you perhaps exploring Christianity for the first time or starting to do it seriously. And part of coming and listening to this talk is part of your search for truth. I'd encourage you to take your questions to the friend that introduced you to this talk and gave you the contact details, and ask them some more questions about why they believe and follow the Lord Jesus. If you live in the Sydenham area, then despite the fact that there's all sorts of lockdowns going on, church is still open on a Sunday. So come along to church and you can actually see people face to face at church, and you can talk and perhaps get some of your questions answered there. And also, I'd like to just let people know that in November, we'll be running another online Christianity Explored course. One of the things that John said was that it's amazing that in the Lord Jesus, God has made himself known. God has stepped into his own creation and made himself known, made himself accessible. And Christianity Explored is a forum, a place where you can come and open the Bible and start to discover the God who's made himself known. So let me encourage you, if you're interested in that, then again, info@gracechurchsydenham.org, and we'll get you more details about how you can be a part of that course. So lots of ways to respond. We should respond to John by giving me a round of applause. Thank you, John. And you can only hear us clapping because everybody else is muted, but you can see them, can't you? Thank you so much, John, for that. Great talk, a challenging talk. You certainly got us all thinking and provided us as well. Those of us who are trying to share our faith with others, you've provided us with some help there too. Thank you, everybody. Thanks especially to John. The talk is on YouTube, so it has been recorded, it is online, so you can share that with other people. But yes, hopefully see many of you on Sunday morning. Thanks, John. Great to see you, and love to Naomi, and all the best, you guys, and hopefully we'll bump into you soon, personally, face to face. Thanks, mate.
Bye, Tim. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
God bless.